Ever notice how you can do everything right? Follow the steps, make the plans, start with energy, and somehow nothing ever works out? You tell yourself, this time is different. You feel focused, motivated, clear. But weeks later, you're right back where you started. Different goals, same ending. And the most frustrating part isn't the failure itself. It's how familiar it feels. You replay the moment it starts slipping. The missed day, the small delay, the quiet excuse that sounds reasonable at the time. No explosion, no disaster. Just a slow drift back to the default. You don't quit. You fade. And eventually, you explain it away. It wasn't realistic. I lost interest. I'll come back to it later. But later never really comes. Here's the question no one asks you out loud. Why does this keep happening in completely different areas of your life? Not once, not twice, but over and over. Different context, same outcome. At some point, it stops feeling like coincidence. It starts feeling personal. Like there's an invisible force pulling you back every time you get close to moving forward. And if you're honest, there's a quiet part of you that expects it now. You don't even get surprised anymore. You get prepared. Prepared to explain. Prepared to restart. Prepared to tell yourself a story that keeps everything intact. That's the real pattern. And once you see that, the question changes from why does nothing work to something much more uncomfortable. Why does this version of your life keep repeating? Here's the part most people skip because it sounds too simple. You're not unlucky, you're not cursed, and you're not uniquely broken. You're just unaware of what's driving you. Carl Jung said it bluntly. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Most people hear that and nod, then go right back to blaming circumstances. But look closer at your own patterns. You don't fail randomly. You fail consistently. There's a timing to it, a familiar point where things start to feel heavy, where enthusiasm turns into hesitation, where action quietly becomes observation. Nothing dramatic happens. No big decision to stop. You just start postponing, second-guessing, telling yourself you'll return to it when conditions are better. And that's the giveaway. Because if the problem were external, the ending would vary. Different obstacle, different reason, different outcome. But the ending stays the same. That means the source is internal. Not in a moral sense. Not because you're weak, but because your mind is doing what it was trained to do. Protect you. Awareness is dangerous because it removes excuses. Once you notice the exact moment you pull back, you can't unnotice it. Once you see the pattern, you can't blame randomness anymore. That's why most people avoid this part. Jung understood this resistance. He said, people will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. So instead of facing it, you stay busy. You consume information. You plan. You prepare. You optimize. All activities that feel productive, without forcing confrontation. Because real awareness asks uncomfortable questions. Why do you hesitate right when consistency is required? Why does confidence disappear after the initial excitement fades? Why does progress feel threatening instead of satisfying? These aren't questions about ability. They're questions about identity. Somewhere along the way, your mind learned that certain outcomes come with risk. Risk of exposure. Risk of responsibility. Risk of having no one left to blame. So it intervenes, subtly, not by stopping you outright, but by nudging you off course just enough to preserve familiarity. And you call it logic, or intuition, or timing. But it's none of those. It's a pattern protecting itself. Once you understand that, something shifts. Because awareness doesn't attack the pattern. It corners it. And when a pattern can no longer hide behind bad luck, it starts to weaken. That's when things stop mysteriously falling apart. Not because life suddenly gets easier, but because you're finally watching yourself closely enough to see what's actually happening. So why familiar failure feels safe? This is where things get uncomfortable. So most people never go here. You tell yourself you want things to work. You say you're tired of starting over. You swear you're ready for change. And you mean it. But there's a quieter truth underneath that intention. Familiar failure feels safer than unfamiliar success. Not because failure feels good, but because it feels known. You already understand disappointment. You already know how to explain it. You already know how to survive it. Success, on the other hand, creates new territory, new expectations, new pressure, new visibility. And your mind doesn't care about your goals nearly as much as it cares about predictability. So when you move toward something that would genuinely change your position, your mind gets nervous. Not loudly, not dramatically. It whispers instead. Slow down. Think about it more. Now isn't the right time. Let's be realistic. Those thoughts sound responsible. They sound mature. But look at when they appear. Right when commitment replaces excitement. Right when consistency matters more than motivation. Right when backing out is still possible without consequences. That timing isn't accidental. Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." Avoidance doesn't always look like fear. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like intelligence. Sometimes it looks like waiting for the right moment. But what's really happening is protection. If you don't fully succeed, you don't have to fully adapt. If you don't go all the way, you don't have to deal with what comes after. Because success doesn't just give you results. It removes excuses. It takes away the story that you're still preparing, still becoming, still almost there. And for some people, that story has become home. So the mind steers you back toward what it knows, not by sabotaging everything, but by ensuring nothing goes far enough to change your identity. You'll notice this if you pay attention. You push hard at the beginning. You enjoy the idea of progress. You feel powerful while it's still optional. Then, when repetition replaces novelty, something shifts. Effort starts to feel heavier than it should. Small obstacles feel strangely convincing. Distractions suddenly feel necessary. That's the safety mechanism activating. Not because you're incapable, but because your system is trying to preserve familiarity. And the most dangerous part? You don't experience this as fear. You experience it as reasoning. That's why the pattern survives for years. Because it doesn't feel like resistance. It feels like common sense. Until you notice that common sense always leads you back to the same place. Once you see that, the question changes. It's no longer, why does this keep failing? It becomes, what part of me feels safer when it does? And that question doesn't have a comfortable answer. But it has an honest one. And honesty is where the pattern starts to crack. Now let's talk about the hidden reward behind self-sabotage. This is the part people avoid because it sounds like blame. But it's not blame. It's leverage. Because once you see the reward, The behavior stops being mysterious. Here's the hard truth. Self-sabotage isn't random. It's strategic. Not consciously, but psychologically. Every pattern you repeat gives you something in return. Not success, not progress, but relief. Relief from pressure. Relief from exposure. Relief from having to prove anything, especially to yourself. That's why it keeps happening. If there were no payoff, the pattern would die on its own. So let's slow this down. Think about the moment right before things usually fall apart. You've already invested time. People might be watching. Expectations are starting to form. And suddenly, the stakes feel heavier than they did at the beginning. This is where self-sabotage quietly steps in. Not with chaos, with comfort. You tell yourself you need more information. You decide to wait and see. You focus on smaller, safer tasks that look productive but don't move the needle. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic. Just enough distance to lower the risk. And the reward is immediate. You feel lighter, less exposed, back in control. That feeling, that release, is the payoff. It teaches your mind, this works. So the next time you get close again, the same behavior activates automatically. Jung understood this dynamic deeply. He said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness here isn't failure. It's the comfort hidden inside it. Because failure, in controlled doses, keeps you safe. As long as you stop short of full commitment, you don't have to confront certain fears. Fear of being seen without excuses. Fear of discovering you're capable, and now responsible. Fear of not knowing who you are without struggle to lean on. That's why people say they want things to work, but behave in ways that quietly ensure they won't. Not because they're lying, because part of them benefits from the outcome. And here's the most unsettling part. Once the payoff becomes familiar, your mind starts engineering situations to recreate it. You don't just react to obstacles. You drift toward them. You choose paths that allow for plausible withdrawal. You commit in ways that can be easily reversed. You leave just enough uncertainty to escape cleanly. And when it falls apart, you feel disappointment, but also something else. Relief. That relief is the clue. Because disappointment hurts, but relief rewards the pattern. And patterns follow rewards. Until you see that, self-sabotage feels like bad luck. Once you see it, it feels deliberate. And that's not a comfortable realization. But it's a powerful one. Because the moment you recognize the reward, you're no longer controlled by it. You're standing at the edge of a choice. And for the first time, the pattern knows you're watching. At some point, struggle stops being a phase and starts becoming a role. Not one you consciously choose, one you slowly adapt to. You don't just experience setbacks anymore. You expect them. And expectation shapes behavior. You begin to see yourself in a specific way. The one with potential. The one who could if things were different. The one who's still preparing, still learning, still getting ready. That role feels harmless, even respectable. But here's the catch. Roles come with limits. Once you identify with a role, your behavior bends to protect it. Progress threatens it. Completion threatens it. Clarity threatens it. Because if you actually cross the line from almost to done, the role dissolves. And the mind resists that. So you unconsciously perform the role instead of escaping it. You talk about what you're working toward more than what you're actually doing. You collect ideas instead of finishing projects. You refine plans long past the point where action would be more useful. All of it feels productive. None of it forces a conclusion. Jung understood how dangerous identification can be. He warned, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. Outgrowing a role requires letting it die. And that's uncomfortable, because roles offer protection. They explain why you haven't arrived yet. They soften judgment. They keep expectations manageable. As long as you're becoming, no one can hold you to what you already are. But there's a cost. When you live inside a role long enough, it stops being a description and becomes a boundary. You don't just avoid failure. You avoid situations where success would demand a new identity. You avoid finishing, because finishing removes ambiguity. You avoid consistency, because consistency creates evidence. You avoid exposure, because exposure collapses the role. So instead, you stay active without being decisive, busy without being effective. And the most convincing part? It feels like progress. But it isn't. It's maintenance. Maintenance of an identity built around effort rather than outcome. That's why breaking the pattern feels like losing something. You're not just changing habits. You're stepping away from a version of yourself that once kept you safe. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But before that happens, you have to stop being who you've been pretending to be. And that's the moment where most people hesitate. Because walking away from a role means standing without one. No explanations, no buffers, no familiar story, just action and the results that come with it. That's why the role holds on so tightly, and why recognizing it is the first real threat to its survival. So, why motivation keeps failing? Motivation feels powerful because it's loud. It shows up fast. It feels convincing. It makes you believe this time will be different. But motivation has a flaw most people don't want to admit. It doesn't change behavior patterns. It just energizes them. That's why you've felt highly motivated and still ended up in the same place. Motivation is an emotional surge. Patterns are structural, and structure always wins. Carl Jung understood this distinction. He said, "A man who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." In other words, you don't overcome patterns by feeling stronger. You overcome them by understanding what feeds them. Motivation thrives at the beginning, when things are optional, when effort feels exciting, when results are still imagined, when failure hasn't entered the picture yet. That's why starting feels good. But motivation collapses the moment repetition appears. The moment progress demands consistency instead of intensity. That's when the real resistance shows up. Not as fear, as boredom, as distraction, as the sudden urge to reorganize, rethink, or reset. And motivation can't survive there. Because motivation depends on novelty. Patterns depend on familiarity. And your mind is loyal to what it knows. This is why motivation often leads you back to the same cycle. You feel inspired. You start again. You push hard at first, and then, right on schedule, the same thoughts return. This isn't working. I should adjust the plan. I need a better approach. Those thoughts feel intelligent, but notice the timing. They arrive exactly when momentum needs to be protected, not questioned. Motivation doesn't teach you how to stay when it gets uncomfortable. It teaches you how to begin. And if your pattern is built around beginning but not finishing, motivation becomes part of the trap. You chase the feeling of starting because starting feels like progress, without demand. Self-sabotage. Jung warned about this kind of loop when he said, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." Motivation offers emotional relief instead of transformation. It lets you feel like you're changing without actually changing anything. That's why relying on motivation keeps you restarting instead of moving forward. Real change begins when you stop asking, "How do I feel about this today?" and start asking, "What do I do when I don't feel like it?" Because the moment motivation fades, the pattern takes over, unless you're aware enough to see it happening. And awareness doesn't feel exciting. It feels quiet, uncomfortable, exposed. But it's the only thing that doesn't disappear when motivation does. That's why motivation keeps failing you. Not because you lack it, but because it was never meant to carry you through the part that actually matters. Now let's get to the moment the pattern breaks. This is the moment everything either changes or resets again. Not with intensity, not with confidence, not with a dramatic decision, with noticing. The pattern doesn't break when you feel ready. It breaks when you catch it in the act, right before you delay, right before you rationalize, right before you choose the familiar exit. That moment is small, almost quiet. And because it's quiet, most people miss it. They think change happens through force, by pushing harder, thinking bigger, demanding more from themselves. But force only strengthens resistance. Awareness disarms it. Carl Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Not the version of you that wants to succeed, the version that benefits from stopping, the one that gets relief from postponing, the one that feels safer, staying almost there." When you see that part without judgment, something strange happens. It no longer needs to hide. Patterns survive on blindness. They weaken under observation. So instead of fighting the urge to stop, you watch it. You notice the physical hesitation, the mental justification forming, the familiar script beginning to play. And you don't argue with it. You don't dramatize it. You simply refuse to obey it automatically. That's the break, not rebellion, interruption. You act without waiting for permission from motivation. You continue without renegotiating the plan. You finish without perfect certainty. This is uncomfortable because it removes the old rewards. No relief, no clean exit, no familiar disappointment to retreat into. Just exposure. And exposure feels dangerous when you're not used to it. But here's the shift most people don't expect. Once you move through that moment a few times, the pattern weakens fast, because it's no longer in control of the decision. It can suggest, but it can't decide. And something else takes its place. Not confidence, not excitement. Stability. You stop measuring progress by how you feel. You stop waiting for the right internal state. You stop asking whether today is different from the last time. You just continue. That's when things start working. Not magically, not instantly, but consistently. The pattern didn't disappear. It lost authority. And once that happens, it can't run your life in the background anymore. Because now, when it shows up, you recognize it. And recognition is the moment power changes hands. That's the moment the pattern breaks, quietly, decisively. And once it does, nothing ever mysteriously fails again. Because now, you're present for the choice. Once you see the pattern for what it is, everything changes. Not immediately, not like flipping a switch, but gradually, quietly, in ways that feel irreversible. The next time you hit that familiar point, the hesitation, the rationalization, the pull back, you don't just feel it. You observe it. You know it's there. You recognize it as the same mechanism that's been running your life for years. And here's the most powerful part. Observation alone weakens it. Patterns live in the shadows. They survive in ignorance. They thrive when you obey automatically. But they can't dominate a mind that watches. For years, nothing worked. You tried, you failed, you rationalized, you restarted. You promised yourself you'd do better next time. And every time, it ended the same. But now you see it. And seeing is different from hoping. It's different from trying. It's different from wishing circumstances would change. Seeing is active. Seeing is conscious. Seeing is accountability without judgment. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." You've made it conscious, and now it no longer directs you. The hesitation doesn't disappear. The rationalization still whispers. The familiar exit still tempts.